Coming to you from the mountains and the plain. The only conservative voices brave enough to push back. This is the Conservative Daily Podcast with Joe Otto.
That's what the Second Amendment was designed to do. If you're going to do something to nullify or take away my rights under the Constitution, come get it.
Max McGuire.
When you look at politicians on the left, they need to convince people that they are victims.
A resistance to the resistance. And now your hosts, Joe Otto and Max McGuire.
And welcome back to another edition of the Conservative Daily Podcast. My name is Max McGuire. Joe Otto is out for today, so it's going to be me. But in a second, we're going to bring in our guest, Jimmy Sengenberger, the host of Jimmy at the Crossroads, which is a show that he puts on in conjunction with the Washington Examiner. And we're going to talk about a lot of the issues of the day. We're going to talk about some of the most ridiculous statues that the left is now targeting. We're going to touch on the Michael Flynn saga and what was just released just minutes ago, handwritten notes that now implicate Obama and Biden in that whole fiasco. And then we're going to talk a little bit about immigration, what Trump is doing. So let's bring him in right now. Welcome to the show, Jimmy Sengenberger. Jimmy, how's it going?
Hey, Max, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Pretty good. It's crazy times that we live in.
That's probably the understatement of the year.
I don't know what's more dangerous, going outside as a conservative or being outside made of bronze or marble. I don't know what is more dangerous because pretty much every statue out there is now under attack. I know that you are a big fan of the blues. Tell us a bit about a famous statue that was just defaced. I believe, Austin, Texas.
Oh, my gosh.
And we have an image for that. Let's throw up image one. Talk a little bit about this.
So Stevie Ray Vaughan is one of the greatest guitar players ever of any genre, hands down. So he died August 27th, 1990. We're coming upon the 30th anniversary of his death. But he was an amazing blues rock guitar player who really helped to expand the blues, which historically, you trace it back. I mean, the blues was started by blacks in America. And he was expanding that into much wider audiences back in the 1980s when he was particularly popular. And he has a statue in Austin, Texas, and FTP, meaning F the police, was written, you see right there on the screen, on his statue. And then also you can see that they smudged up the face and all that. At least they didn't tear it down. But look, this was a guy who had literally nothing to do whatsoever with politics, with race, with anything along those lines. He was, by all accounts, I know people who knew him, he was a decent, honorable, good-hearted, and humble man who also, if you look at interviews he did or exchanges he did with some of the black blues legends that came before him, the respect that he showed and the admiration that he showed for them was tremendous, and exactly as it should be. The idea that these so-called protesters would deface a statue like that of Stevie Ray Vaughan shows that they are just not serious one bit. A lot like how they were not serious when they tore down Ulysses S. Grant's statue, the guy who, I don't know, got the surrender of the Confederacy. Clearly, This is not about Black Lives Matter.
He took the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, and then he presided over at least part of Reconstruction, but they want to tear down Ulysses S. Grant. They want to tear down Francis Scott Key. They're going after Catholic Saint Junipero Serra because he wasn't nice to Native Americans, apparently, in his attempt to convert them to Catholicism. I know you wanted to talk about this, and this is incredible because Stevie Ray Vaughan was not a racist anywhere I can find.
He wasn't even a politician. I mean, I guess what you could say is that the one thing that he did that was sort of political is he performed live at one of George H.W. Bush's inauguration parties in 1989 because Lee Atwater asked him to do so. He did it. So did black blues legend Albert Collins, and so did Stevie Ray Vaughan's brother, Jimmy Vaughan. They all performed. Maybe that's the sin. I don't know. I think they're just looking for statues randomly to do this too.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Black Lives Matter didn't deface his statue because of a concert he gave in 1989 to George H.W. Bush. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that their history isn't that strong. And this is what I don't understand. Is it just, are they going after any statue? Is it just statues in general? Or are they that mistaken that they believe he was a racist? Because either they're very, very ignorant, or this is a much bigger attack than we even know, because you're seeing statues to like George Washington being sprayed with sayings like, this is indigenous land. You are on indigenous land. That's a lot different than going after slaveholders. When you see that kind of graffiti beyond just Black Lives Matter, that's anti-Americanism. That denies the United States' right to even exist in this territory. So when you see them going after cultural icons, it seems to be a bigger attack.
Well, but so many of these people do seem to be ignorant of American history and the specifics. I mean, the idea that Ulysses S. Grant, who, yes, he was a slave owner, I believe he had one slave who he later freed. He was destitute at one point in his life, and he could have sold his slave and gotten a lot of money for it. He declined to do so, and instead eventually freed his slave. He also was, as you pointed out, very much involved in Reconstruction, trying to enforce racial peace down in the South. I mean, the way in which Grant took on the KKK was tremendous, especially given how that was the era where the KKK was at its height, where it was most vicious, doing all that they could to literally destroy the lives of former slaves. And KKK, they were no match for Grant, the way that he went about it. And not only that, but in addition to that, and Appomattox, I mean, Ulysses S. Grant was somebody who really made a point of getting the 15th Amendment moved forward, which ensured that blacks would have the right to vote. Now, of course, we did have the laws in various states that made that more difficult.
There was an asterisk at the end of that.
There
was an asterisk at the end of that. But
what he did was tremendously remarkable. And the thing is that I can't tell, you're right, I can't tell if this is just ignorant or if they're just assuming, hey, this is a statue of some American, therefore it must be racist. It could be either way. It could be both, some one, some the other.
This is some white man, and obviously he's deserving of being destroyed. Now, when you sent me that Stevie Ray Vaughan news, I thought you had found the stupidest statue that had been defaced. But in the couple hours this morning, I think I beat you. I think I found a dumber statue. And I want to throw this clip up. This is in Madison, I believe Madison, Wisconsin. And this is a statue dedicated to Hans Christian Heg, who was a hero in the Union. He died serving his country. And before the Civil War, he was actually part of a militia group that would go after and attack slave catchers trying to reapprehend slaves that had escaped to the North. This man was literally in a militia, a paramilitary group that went after slave catchers trying to reapprehend black people in the North. And this is what the leftist mob did to his statue last night. Let's go to cut one. So that is, by all definitions... They didn't just deface that,
they tore it down.
Yeah, they tore it down. They then ripped off his head of the statue, and then they tossed the remains in a lake.
Yeah.
And this man was anti-slavery to the core.
It's like Matthias Baldwin in Philadelphia. His statue was attacked by these radicals, and he was a noted abolitionist. So that's why I think it's probably more number two. They just don't know. I doubt these people are doing research to find out which statues they should target and which statues they should not target.
Yeah, it could be ignorance, considering the fact that they now want to tear down Abraham Lincoln statues. But I mean, that requires a significant amount of ignorance, because anyone who gets through fourth grade social studies can tell you that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, even if they can't tell you the details.
Last week, the left was talking about how they wanted to make Juneteenth a national holiday. What was Juneteenth? Well, it was this town in Texas that finally got the word of, finally got word of the Emancipation Proclamation. Who wrote and issued the Emancipation Proclamation? Was it this guy,
Abraham
Abraham Lincoln, that they now want to remove? Aren't they expressly contradicting themselves? Hey, we should
Doesn't make
celebrate the
sense.
Emancipation Proclamation, but we should tear down the guy who issued it and wrote it.
Yeah. Don't get me started on Juneteenth. Anyone who wants to celebrate it is free to do so. It's just a holiday that commemorates Galveston, Texas, learning about an executive order 1,001 days after it was signed.
But
That's what the holiday is.
The point here and why I bring it up is that
I get it.
It shows how ridiculous they are. I mean, here's the thing. The number one thing, Max, that is so significant about what this demonstrates, all these tearing down, the tearing down of statues and all the other nonsense, is that the radicals that are doing this are not sincere and they're not serious. They're doing this because they want to push the limits and see how far they can get away with things, how far they can go before they get punished or stopped. And they are pushing the limits without much recourse, and that's what's scary.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So if you guys agree that this is scary, make sure you hit that share button, because Facebook is going to throttle us to stop people from organically finding it. So please do hit the share button if you're watching this on Facebook, or share it if you're watching this on YouTube. Hit that share button. And if you want to call in and tell us what you think about any of this, our number is 888-441-1121. It's the statues. It's insane. I do believe that it's an attack on Americanism itself. I think that yes, it's a good part ignorance, but I also believe that these people look at these people are inherently racist. They look at a white-skinned statue, a statue depicting a white man, and they assume that it's part of some Caucasian white patriarchy that needs to be toppled. Even if that white man is Abraham Lincoln and the statue is literally him freeing the slaves, they'll find a reason to call anything racist. And I agree. I think some of it is ignorance, but I do think when we're seeing what they're spray painting on this, that the United States doesn't even have a right to exist in Western territories, that we should just forget the founders. I do think it really strikes at the core of what this country is founded on.
Well, I watched a video probably a month and a half ago of a radical leftist group here in the Denver metro area in Colorado. And there was a city council member for Aurora. In fact, my city council member in Aurora, Juan Marcano, who is an outright socialist. And he began his remarks as per this Zoom meeting, which managed to get out in public. I got a copy of it. He began his remarks by acknowledging that we were on land of indigenous people and going on in that direction. So what we're seeing here is just the manifestation in physical form of the kind of rhetoric that the radical left has been using in order to go after and diminish the United States of America in any way, shape, or form that they can. And it is stunning to see how far they're able to get now with so little rebuke, so little recourse on the part of mayors and governors and other politicians who seem to be more kowtowing to them. Look, I am a conservative who will say there are legitimate grievances of Black Lives Matter, folks, and I think the majority of people who actually say they believe in Black Lives Matter really do, and they're genuine, and they're not radicals, and they just would like to see a better world for people that they think are discriminated against. These thugs and extremists that are tearing things down are not genuine advocates. They're either full-out radicals or they just don't care, and they're trying to get whatever limits pushed as they can.
Yeah, I can understand that, and Paul Sullivan writes in the Facebook comment section. It's called the dumbing down of America. I think that's true. I think that's fair. I do think though that if we're talking about what people are owed, the blood of Union soldiers spilt to free slaves, right? That debt was paid generations ago in the blood that now soaks the lands in the border states and in the South. That debt was paid. And the problem is that it doesn't just stay with, oh, Black Lives Matter. It becomes in this conversation about reparations and the idea that people who never owned slaves owe something to people who were never slaves themselves. So it becomes a lot more radical. It doesn't just stop at, oh, we shouldn't kill Black people, because everyone agrees with that. But it takes all of 3 seconds to go from maybe we shouldn't kill Black people to you're standing on indigenous land and you don't even have a right to your house.
It's such an important point. One thing I've been raising, Max, I think that's such an important point, is that when George Floyd's murder happened, it was like universal that the nation was
Oh, yeah.
outraged. This needs to be handled. Those guys need to be locked up. You need to go through the process. And we were all outraged that it wasn't done more quickly. The arresting of particularly Officer Chauvin and so forth, those things didn't happen more quickly. They had open ears in a way we hadn't had before. And then they decided to just throw it away and go in these extreme directions. And now we're well beyond any discussion of George Floyd, any discussion of Black Lives Matter. And we're pretty much only talking about riots and looting and destruction of property. And one point I want to make about property rights are important still in America, believe it or not. It may not be to leftists who want to eradicate the idea of private property, but they are significant. And not only that, when we look at public property, that is still property owned by the government. We can have a reasonable debate and discussion about removing Confederate statues. Statues or monuments that honor Confederate leaders through a legal process where you can actually have that removed after a vote or what have you. The idea that any sort of property like this should just be torn down by extremists who think, this is okay, that is fundamentally anti-American because it goes against the very notion of property rights. Even if it is public property, it's still property owned by somebody, and they have no right to tear it down.
They don't. And it's funny. You see what's happening in New York where they want to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which anyone who studied post-apartheid South Africa, that's what they did there. That was Nelson Mandela pushing that instead of locking people up, you put them alongside and they explain their grievances and they kind of just talk and work out their differences. They want to have that in New York, which is funny because there's nowhere near the amount of actual oppression in New York that we saw in South Africa at the time. What's crazy, though, is that the part of the reason that these monuments exist, even in the first place, most of them were put there in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And the reason that they exist was because the United States government went out of their way to try and bring the South back into the fold. They had the option either to treat them like Germany was post-World War I, right? You need to pay us for everything you did. We're going to destroy your economy. You're just going to be subjugated. And they understood that you do that to a nation and you get what Germany got a couple of years later with Hitler. Instead, they wanted to bring the South back into the fold. And part of that was giving amnesty to people who served in the Confederacy, officers. So as long as they weren't bona fide war criminals who were prosecuted, almost everyone else who worked or served in the Confederacy got amnesty as long as they pledged allegiance to the Constitution. So when these monuments went up, they went up to people who already got amnesty for everything they did. They got citizenship, and they went up in this spirit of reconciliation. Now, some were very antagonistic. I completely understand that. Sending Confederate leaders to the Rotunda in D.C., very antagonistic. I get that. But most of these were put up by organizations that were only 1 or 2 generations removed from the actual Civil War itself. So to now come back and demand posthumous blood when the Union at the time was pushing reconciliation, it just looks so petty. It looks so small, and it's just plainly obvious that it's just the wrong move. I don't know. It just seems very hypocritical.
I think local communities should be able to make determinations as to whether or not they want these statues of Confederate leaders still up in their communities, especially these many decades later since they were put up. But to tear them down, particularly in ignorance of the historical context that you just laid out, or any historical understanding. I mean, go back to Stevie Ray Vaughan. This guy was a guitar player who helped expand the blues to much wider audiences, and oftentimes did things in tribute to great black blues guitarists who helped pave the way for him, and in the utmost respect for, say, the 3 kings of the blues, Albert King and Freddie King and B.B. King. But they don't care about any of that.
Yeah.
Same thing here when we're looking at double standards, too, in terms of the protests. And I know you've talked about this, too. If you have a Black Lives Matter protest, that's okay. In fact, physicians will even say, it's okay for you to go out and do this kind of protest because we think that there are other health issues associated with systemic racism and so on and so forth. But those lockdown protests, they don't qualify, even though there are a hell of a lot of mental and physical health issues that have come from being told you must be in your homes, from the mental
absolutely.
health crises, suicide, to not getting to get biopsies, to being out of work indefinitely.
Yeah.
The list goes on, and yet you're not supposed to go out and protest that. And then in Lincoln County, Washington, where they've now said you must wear a mask. Well, if you're a person of color and
Only
you have concerns,
if you're right.
then in Washington State, in this one county, Lincoln County, you have the exception for people of color who have subjective concerns. On my show on Jimmy at the Crossroads today, I did my opening monologue saying that's an express violation of the Equal Protection Clause of, ironically, the 14th Amendment, which was passed during Reconstruction to make sure that people of all races were treated equally under the law. Not happening in Lincoln County, Washington, with masks.
Yeah, no. For months we were told that coronavirus disproportionately affects Black and brown people, and that we need to do more to protect them. And then the county in Oregon, Lincoln, they exempt African Americans from having to wear masks.
All people of color.
It defies logic, and we're hearing it still. This spike. I mean, I live in San Antonio, and there is a significant spike to the point where I'm getting tested today because I'm starting to have symptoms, and I didn't go to any protest or anything, but there's a significant spike. And if you look at the calendar, it is exactly 2 weeks after the massive protests that the city saw, where people were out in the street defying all social distancing. And what you hear from the experts is, oh, we have no evidence to prove that the protest caused a spike. And yet, if you dare go outside to get groceries a couple months ago, they told you were going to be killing grandma. It's obviously being politicized. The fact that you had that nurse in Denver have that photo op shaming the people driving through the city and protesting, and now today you're seeing nurses applauding the Black Lives Matter protesters. It's just so obviously political. I want to shift gears a little bit.
Can I just make one more point? And that is, look, in terms of these protests, I personally have no problem with Black Lives Matter protesters getting out and peacefully protesting amid coronavirus. I think, in fact, some of the peaceful protests have been rather inspiring in some circumstances. Some of the things that happened in Denver during the daytime I thought were pretty encouraging. But I also think that if you want to get out and you want to protest lockdowns and being forced out of work or anything else, the Constitution guarantees your right to peaceably assemble and to free speech, regardless of the position that you are taking. It doesn't matter what kind of protest you're moving forward with and going to march for. What matters is that you're able to do it. And so the idea that these politicians and these doctors and anybody else who's woke can say, well, this is okay, but this isn't, is absurd. Just allow it across the board. Same standard. Freedom.
Yeah. I agree, but I do question how many of these so-called peaceful protests are actually peaceful, because the mainstream media is going out of its way. I've literally watched news reports on CNN, ABC, CBS, where they show people literally tearing down statues, and they're being labeled as protesters.
Well, recently, that's what's going on more than anything. Oh, yeah, no, exactly right. Exactly. The media is conflating two things as being simply the same, and I really think it's important for them. If they really believe in advancing the agenda of Black Lives Matter from the social standpoint, not the radical, let's defund police, some of the policy standpoints, but overall, they would clearly want to distinguish between the two instead of allowing these extremists to say, hey, we're going to tear down statues and we're going to go loot and just excuse it. I mean, that's not, if you're going to excuse that and shield that from consequences or from criticism, then you are not a genuine advocate for a cause you claim to be supporting.
Yeah. I want to switch gears because it's actually kind of the same. We talk about police officers abusing their power, and it's been really funny watching in Congress as they're debating the bill over police reform, how the Republicans try and add identical language to restrict FBI agents, right? So if you're going to have the police all wear body cameras, maybe all of the FBI agents should wear body cameras when they're interrogating Trump officials, right? All these notes that went missing from the interrogation of Flynn. Today, I don't know if you saw this, but just before you came on, they hinted at it yesterday, but it's finally released. We have new notes, new handwritten notes in the whole Michael Flynn situation, and the appeals court just came down today with a ruling that says that the radical judge who's been trying to keep Flynn on the road to jail, he has to now drop the whole case. But we also have these new notes, and I want Mr. Producer, if you can throw them on the screen, that image I sent you. This is chicken scratch, but I want to explain what this is. This is handwritten notes written by Peter Strzok, one of the Lovebirds, as James Comey was recounting what happened in the meeting where Barack Obama and Joe Biden were discussing how to investigate Flynn.
With Sally Yates, that meeting?
Yes, that meeting, the Sally Yates meeting. And you can throw that image up again. I'm just going to read real quickly what it says, because it is chicken scratch. So NSA says Flynn cuts other countries. DAG lean forward on, that's classified. Biden then talks about the Logan Act. President Obama then says, according to James Comey relaying this to Peter Strzok, these are unusual times. Vice President Biden said, I've been on the Intel Committee for 10 years and I never, it just handwritten scratch. President Obama, make sure you look at things and have the right people on it. Obama, is there anything I shouldn't be telling transition team? And then I don't know who D is in this case. Flynn, Kislyak calls appear to be legit. And then they laugh that it was a Happy New Year call. So in this, not only do we have Vice President Biden advocating using the Logan Act against Michael Flynn, but you have handwritten notes of James Comey telling Peter Strzok, who Peter Strzok was the FBI official at the heart of all of this, the whole anti-Trump scheme in the FBI, telling him this. You had Obama saying, use the Logan Act, which has never been successfully prosecuted against anyone in our history because it's unconstitutional. You can't criminalize someone talking to a foreign leader. And you have President Obama now in these notes saying, make sure you look at things and have the right people on it. We now know that investigation was BS from the start. They have to drop the whole thing because it was never, they hid evidence from Flynn. The whole thing was crooked. Jimmy, I don't know if you've seen this before you came on. I was hoping I might catch you a little off guard with this.
I hadn't yet.
What do you think about this?
Okay, so no, I hadn't seen about this yet. I was just wrapped up my show, was doing some final things after that, getting out of here. One, I'm not surprised. Already with enough information that we'd been provided with particularly because of the yeoman's work of Sidney Powell, whom I've interviewed before, Michael Flynn's lawyer, really trying to get this kind of information out there, and others who've done investigative reporting and so forth. I'm not surprised based on that, but I'm also still just stunned that this kind of thing would happen. And it's like old news to the media. You know, they were all up in arms when Flynn was the guy going after, that they were going after, and he was pleading guilty and all this. But suddenly, when information comes out that exonerates him and proves that this was a hit job from the start, then it doesn't matter. Then the media can just ignore it. Oh, and you see Don Lemon and others on CNN and so forth saying, well, now they're just trying to distract from the coronavirus failures. It's like, no, for months and months and months and months still, you were obsessing over this. Now there is information, and we've got even more today, that supports that the president, now President of the United States, Donald Trump, and his campaign, and Michael Flynn, and all the rest, were being targeted specifically by the Obama administration. Yeah, it's just a distraction. You don't need to pay attention to it. Hell no. You need to be highlighting this, putting the spotlight directly on this. I mean, this is the president of the United States, and by the way, Joe Biden running to be president of the United States, who claimed in, what was it, with George Stephanopoulos or some interview, where he said, I knew that there was investigation. I didn't have anything to do with it. All I knew is they were doing an investigation. Baloney.
And now these notes indicate that just as Sally Yates was caught off guard, because we know from her testimony that she was caught off guard by this. She didn't know that there was going to be an investigation into Flynn, and she was the deputy attorney general at the time.
Wasn't she the one who took notes? She took notes from the time, contemporaneous notes. She knew something was wrong. Notes.
Susan Rice then sent the email saying, don't look at this. We did everything by the book. We didn't break any laws. Don't worry.
Susan Rice, who lied about Benghazi in a video and now wants to be vice president. I mean, they're now thinking that she could be that person.
We talk about holding police accountable. These notes were hidden from Flynn for years. They've been hidden from the public for years. These notes existed. These were notes between for a conversation between James Comey and Peter Strzok. Absolutely, they were work product. The fact that they were hidden this long after the FBI had a court order to produce them, it speaks of the hypocrisy in all of this, because if you or I were under subpoena and we didn't hand over evidence and there was evidence that we withheld something, we'd already be in prison. But because these people have a little badge to check into the FBI headquarters every day, they are held to a different standard.
Well, but it's not even just that. It's the left applies double standards to people that are on its side. We were just talking about double standards in terms of face masks expressly in Lincoln County, Washington. Certain groups, white people, need to wear masks. If you're not white, if you're a person of color and you might feel concerned, you don't have to. Or with the statues being torn down, or with the going to protest, which people can go to protest. Then you have this circumstance where this is the chosen left group, which is the FBI officials and other Democratic leaders like President Obama and then Vice President Joe Biden. They are all part of it, so they get a pass. But conservatives or people that they don't like, you're in that group, you don't get that same kind of treatment. Double standards run amok. That's the story of the left now, Max.
Yeah, it is. And it's just, the whole thing's double standard. It's so frustrating because anyone with even slight objectivity, even a remote amount of objectivity, can tell that this investigation was cooked. Right? They can tell that it's unreasonable to tell conservatives you're going to kill grandma if you step 1 foot outside, but 15,000 people can rally in front of a museum in Brooklyn protesting for Black trans lives, not even Black lives, a subset of Black lives, and that's completely okay. Don't worry, the virus is on holiday, right? Virus is on vacation. You can go shoulder to shoulder, but don't you dare try and protest for your right to earn a livelihood, right? If you're an armed protester and you don't hurt anyone, don't break anything, you're a terrorist. If you're an armed Black Lives Matter protester and you kill people in Chaz, oh no, that's just a summer of love. That's just the summer of love.
You know what? I saw a video of Andrea Mitchell from MSNBC. Did you see this? Where she was in the attempted Black House autonomous zone, and she was like, "Where are the police when you need them?" It's like, don't you get the irony of that statement?
She was chased by some cross-dresser. It's the strangest video.
Randomly.
She's just
walking
down the street
when you need them.
Yeah. I don't want to presume this person's gender. I would never want to do that. But from my vantage point, it appeared to be a man wearing a dress chasing down Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the least powerful congressperson. It's a very funny.
And the reason why, of course, is she's a congresswoman from D.C. and doesn't have a vote. So that's why she's the least powerful.
But if Nancy Pelosi gets her way, they're voting this week to hopefully start that process and give the Democrats an extra congressperson and 2 extra senators. If they have their way, they're going to give D.C. statehood.
Absorb it into Virginia or something.
Yeah,
that makes more sense to me.
It's going to run into conflict with that pesky Constitution that says the capital has to be a district and not part of any state. But when has the Constitution ever stopped Democrats? Listen, it was this thing was written by a slaveholder, Jimmy. We can't trust it anymore.
The Constitution is an irrelevant, old, dusty document that just needs to be updated with the times. That's all that needs to happen. Okay, that's not what I believe, just to be clear, but that is the attitude of the left. Let's just toss it out. Now, I do have to say that there are instances where I can find that the right does the same thing, but not nearly to the extent of the left, especially when it comes to all sorts of government programs that are blatantly unconstitutional or different carve-outs and exceptions and this and that. I mean, it's so funny to see this resurgence of the 10th Amendment. Remember during the debate when Trump said, I might force the states to reopen churches. And then suddenly the Democrats and the left are like, wait a second, there's that pesky 10th Amendment that's getting in the way. It's like, did you just discover that? Really? Because I've known that all along. And I think also that the right to freedom of religion is guaranteed in the federal Constitution and has been incorporated to the states.
Debate with them. You can't have that debate with them. They're like states' rights. You're like, well, what about the First Amendment? States' rights. well, what about the 14th Amendment that says if the state violates the First Amendment, the federal government's allowed to intervene? Nope, states' rights. These people don't actually work through their arguments. They're just fed these talking points. And it's like whenever there's a shooting, all the people come out and they become gun control experts for a week. And they spout the stupidest things you've ever heard. And then they all go back they disappear. It's like that with every issue with the left. They just they think they're experts on everything. I want to switch gears because I want to hit this topic too, because I was talking to you about this a little bit last night, and it's what Trump is doing with immigration now. So we have, by my count, still 45 million Americans out of work, and that is people who are employees. That doesn't even include people who are contractors, who are no longer able to work, who have either lost their business or been let go, business owners who might not qualify for unemployment, but they're out of a job. It's likely much higher. President Trump this week suspended most work visa programs through the end of the year at the very least, but said it could probably last longer, but at the very least through January. And we're seeing a major pushback from the establishments of both parties, well, the left as a whole, but also establishment Republicans, who seem to think it's a winning argument with this many Americans out of work to bring foreign workers into the country to do what little jobs are available instead of Americans. It's so maddening because every now and then we see this wing of the GOP pop up. And it's the GOP, part of the GOP that doesn't actually serve the people. They serve the corporate interests, the donor groups, the businesses that want to just hire as cheap as possible, even if it means not hiring Americans. Talk a bit about what is going on. Talk a little bit about, even if you have to play devil's advocate, the arguments that the GOP is pushing when they're saying that you have to keep bringing people into the country to work jobs that Americans are more than qualified to hold.
Well, see, to me, there are complicating factors to this issue because by and large, I mean, I'm a believer that we shouldn't have restrictions on who businesses. I'm very much a libertarian, as you know, when it comes to economic issues. So I would have no minimum wage, for example, and of course, that's for people in the United States in terms of the minimum wage. But there are a whole range of regulatory restrictions and constraints that I would just do away with and have more of a free market. I would say that generally speaking would include a lot of the immigration visas, work visas, and so forth. However, what I will say is that there are two important things to keep in mind. Number one, in terms of the way, for example, the H-1B visa is structured, as I understand it, there are different standards that must be met for a worker to come in from another country using the H-1B visa, say you want to do tech support or some sort of tech position here in the United States, that you have fewer restrictions, fewer requirements that must be met in terms of Social Security, in terms of some other things that you have to apply to an American worker. So there literally is no playing field in that case between an American worker and a foreign worker who's brought in when that foreign worker doesn't have the employer and that worker don't have to meet the same regulatory burdens as is the case for an American citizen. I don't think that's right. I think you need to have equality across the board, but also I think that in terms of a step like this from President Trump, I mean, I can understand something perhaps being done on a short-term basis, say like for a year. Let's have a year timeout in these ways, and during that time maybe even restructure the program or what have you. I don't like the use of the word indefinite. I think it's very problematic to me when the government does anything one way or the other in terms of saying that it's indefinite. But I also think the biggest impediment to making this a viable thing too in terms of the workers, because obviously you're going to have businesses and as you said, establishment Republicans and others who will make the argument, look, we need these workers because Americans are asking for too much. Here's one of the reasons why Americans may be asking for too much. The excessive government assistance that the Democrats had offered in the CARES Act in terms of the $600 extra per week, and they are insisting on extending that literally has gotten workers to tell their employers, I don't want to come back to work because I'm not making enough money at your work compared to what I'm getting from the government. I think if that's the case, then that bolsters their argument if you have that in place, because it does become more expensive.
I don't know if I buy that, because these are programs that have been abused for years, right? Trump eliminated
Tighten 'em
or
up,
shut
sure.
down shut down what's called a J1 visa, which is essentially when foreigners come in to the country on like an educational experience visa, like an exchange student, and they're allowed to work here, but it's not really a job, it's cultural exchange. So these people work as lifeguards, they work as camp counselors, they work at the boardwalk if you go into the shore in New Jersey or Maryland or any of these other shore communities. They work at the kiosk in the boardwalk. That is the reason that companies take advantage of this is not because there's some inherent benefit of having an Eastern European making the saltwater taffy. There's no cultural relevance. There's no cultural exchange happening when the Eastern European is making your saltwater taffy. They're doing it because the program allows them to pay them next to nothing.
Sure.
In some cases, they actually get nothing for the privilege of coming to the United States and living here for a summer. So it's built into these different profit models,
that's where
right?
I think that there's a case to be made very strongly for at the minimum reform of these programs, especially the J1. I had been unfamiliar with that until you told me about it yesterday, and I do have issues with that. I think that's a legitimate program to say, wait a second, what the heck's going on here? Basically, you're bringing over free labor for these businesses. Yeah. And I understand that if you were to remove that or do significant rollbacks, you would have the negative economic consequences for a lot of these businesses who then would see their costs go up. But in a case like the J1, I see a more strong reason for maybe eliminating that program altogether. I'm not saying I support it. I need to learn more about it, but I'm open to that kind of a conversation. When you get to the H-1B visa, I think you need more reevaluation of some of the structural components to how that program works. And I think it's something more where you need a timeout at most, as opposed to saying indefinite or just eliminating that kind of a program altogether.
H-1B has been a sham, though, from the very beginning. In order to bring someone into the country on an H-1B visa, you have to certify the federal government that you tried to hire an American and you couldn't find anyone who was qualified, able, and willing to do the job, right? We're talking about literally a Silicon Valley company saying they can't find any coders in California. They have to bring someone in from India. It's a lie. It's always been a lie. Most of these companies never even put the jobs out for Americans. They just want to bring in cheaper labor because they're able to pay these foreign imported workers less, because part of the benefit of getting this job is getting to work in the United States. So people are willing to work for less than the average American would demand, because part of that job is a one-way ticket to the United States.
Does the minimum wage apply to H-1B?
But these are white collar jobs, so they typically don't include. They usually require some kind of specialization, some kind of education, some kind of training.
See, my thing is, overall, I have no problem with businesses, broadly speaking, being able to hire who they feel is appropriate for a position, no matter where they're from. Where I can have an issue is when we get to the specifics of how that program operates, if there's a disincentive expressly built into the structure of it for hiring an American worker versus hiring a foreign-born worker, which is why I think changing the way that these programs are set up is entirely a discussion that we should have. Because if you are saying, oh, these are things you must do if you hire an American worker, but you don't need to do these things if they're a foreign worker under this program, no. No, you can hire somebody from a foreign country, but make sure that you have the same kind of standards that are applied.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about DACA, too. The Supreme Court says that DACA, you have to keep that in effect, Trump, because you haven't taken into account the hardship that will be faced by illegal immigrants if they all of a sudden lose their work permits. Work permits that by statute they're not allowed to have. They're not eligible to work in the United States. To talk about the hardship that they face, a lot of times there's a lot of conflation. The left will say, well, who's going to pick our strawberries? First of all, very racist to say that. But second of all, 1 in every 8 DACA recipients, amnesty recipients, are white-collar workers. So if we have 700,000 of these people, roughly, a little less than 100,000 people are in the country right now working white-collar jobs, and they're not legally allowed to do it. But they're doing it because Barack Obama said that they could.
Yeah.
And we're told we can't force them out because it would hurt them. But where's the actual empathy for the millions, the tens of millions of Americans who are out of work? I see Democrats caring more about keeping those illegal aliens in jobs than getting the American people back to work.
But they're not. They don't really show care because they just want to keep in place an executive order because it's easy. They don't want to go through the machinations of getting something done through Congress to actually pass a law. Here's my feelings on that. First of all, I think the Supreme Court not only should have ruled the other way, but it should have ruled the other way, arguing that DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, is blatantly unconstitutional. And yes, a president of the United States can and should be able to repeal a previous executive order by a previous president of the United States. They did some cockamamie idea, basically arguing procedural grounds. You didn't follow through with the proper steps. You can do it again, but you need to make sure that you do these particular steps. That was, as I think Justice Thomas pointed out, basically a cop-out here for the court, the majority, written by Roberts in this case, once again, to get out of having to make the actual ultimate decision on the constitutionality. I mean, Roberts has a history now on the court of making weaselly decisions, taking a pretzel or taking a case in his decision and making a pretzel out of it in order to get to whatever conclusion he thinks will best protect the institution of the court. However, I will say that I do think that Congress can and should provide a legal status. You and I have argued about this before, to these DACA recipients, or what some call the dreamers, because I do believe that if you move to this country as a child through no fault of your own, and you only know the United States of America, you should not be tossed out. But it needs to be done through Congress, not through a president of the United States suddenly finding himself this kind of authority and doing it via an executive order. Which is why I think the Supreme Court was wrong.
Yeah, if a parent sneaks a child into Disney World and they get caught, the child doesn't get to stay behind and ride the rides.
Bad analogy. And here's the reason why we're talking about a bad analogy. Let me explain why, and then you can counterpoint. So let's say you come here at 3 or 4 years old, and you are now 20, and you're under a program like DACA, ideally through Congress. 4 years old, you move to the United States, you don't know your home country, you have no recollection of it, you've lived your whole life pretty much here for 16 years in the United States. That's not the same as going to Disneyland for a day.
Yeah,
this is about how you're being brought up.
I reject the premise because the data does not show high enough levels of assimilation to suggest that DACA recipients do not understand their native cultures.
I'm saying it's not just about assimilation or understanding native cultures. It's about your familiarity with the area and what have you. And also your friends and your relationships and your experiences and your connections and your opportunities. You put somebody back who was raised in the United States back into a third world country, their life is going to be screwed when they only know what life is like in the United States of America.
Not at all. They've been educated.
I'm not saying
here,
you welcome them in. I'm saying if you've lived here for a long time and you've grown up here, you should be able to remain in the country that is your country.
I cannot think of a better form of foreign aid than to send a bunch of U.S. educated high school and college graduates back to what you explain as legitimately third world countries.
Not by force.
I predict that these people will be welcomed. They'll be welcomed as heroes. Jimmy, can you name a country on earth where you go there and the minute you make a friend, you're allowed to stay?
First of all, I don't think that this is about whether or not somebody will be welcomed in their home country, original country of birth.
This isn't their home country, though.
It is much more about, I'm saying if they're back to their original home country, their original, let's say, a country down in South America, for example. It's not about that. It's about the government of the United States forcing you out to a country that you don't recall, that you never lived in really, except for when you were very little, and that sort of circumstance. I think it is unjust for the government to expel you from the country that in many of the, I would say most cases, people I've met who've been DACA recipients have been positive about America, love this country, they're part of this country. It's not about just saying, oh, you get across the border, you're here for a day, and then you get to stay. Absolutely not. And I'm all for building the wall, too, although not unilaterally. Let's have Congress
Yeah.
fund it more. But that's my view, is that I think that it is unjust to force somebody who knows this country and is their country and has been for many years throughout their childhood, and just say, nope, now you got to go because we say so. But again,
So
Congress has to do it. So if there isn't
Yeah.
congressional authorization, then yes, you should be at risk of deportation.
But why is it that the longer someone breaks the law, the less enforceable that law should be?
Well, we're talking about children who were raised up in the United States of America,
right now,
knowing
these people
this
are in their
country from
20s and
birth.
30s.
If you come in but they were raised in this country as children. They know this country as their home country. I'm not talking about people who came here as adults. They should be removed from the United States of America, not just given amnesty or anything like that. If they came here as adults through their own fault and their own decision making, we're talking about children who came here through no fault of their own. I'm narrow in that regard, but also narrow in the sense of saying Congress needs to be authorizing this. But beyond that, we're not going to find agreement, I guess, about these DACA recipients and dreamers.
I don't want to suggest that you aren't prioritizing Americans, but I have a really hard time. I have a really hard time being empathetic with the plight of people who, sure, yeah, they were trafficked into another country. That is a shame, and shame on their parents for putting them in this situation. But it's a situation that was created by their parents or their guardians, not a situation that we created.
They still lived, let's say, a decade and a half or more in this country, raised as children.
But that doesn't absolve the issue.
It doesn't absolve their parents of the issue of culpability there. For example, when I moved here at 10 years old to Colorado from New Jersey, of course, it was interstate, American citizens, American states. I get granted that. But I didn't want to come to Colorado. Ask my parents. I was crying. I was upset, but I was a 10-year-old kid. And this is what my parents said we were going to do, and I had no choice in the matter. That's the same thing for the vast majority of these children. Originally, they came here as children. And they came here. They were told with their parents, here's what we're going to do. Come along. And they come here, and then they're raised in America. I don't think you should be expelled from that country under those circumstances.
So if someone breaks the law long enough, the law doesn't matter.
It's not about simply breaking the law long enough.
Well,
it is about a child
because
who was not knowingly complicit in violating the laws of the United States to get in the country, and then was raised here. And then you have to consider that humanitarian factor, which is why I say a law should be passed to allow for that sort of an exemption and legal status, as opposed to just saying, hey, we'll just let you stay because the president says so. I do think there's an important distinction there, going to the point that they did unknowingly break the law as children with their parents. And so we do need to account for that through the legal process of actually passing a law.
The challenge is that, as I mentioned, these people are in their 20s, 30s, some cases even 40s now. It is physically impossible for them to have remained in the country this long without committing other crimes. It just is not possible. You cannot live in a country.
How can you draw that conclusion?
You believe that you can live in a country illegally for 20, 30, 40 years without violating immigration law?
Well, I don't know if it's possible now. Well, with violating immigration law, for sure. I mean,
how are they feeding themselves? How are they feeding themselves?
That you absolutely. Well, they've probably been hired, perhaps hired under the table by an employer who broke the law. Go after the employers.
So they're not breaking the law?
If a worker is hired for a job and that the employer then has broken the law.
So they're not reporting taxes, so they haven't broken any tax laws?
Well, it depends on well, first of all, if it's not being taken out in taxes the way an employee is, they're not considered contract labor. So. Well, if you are working into a job and you are not, because you can't legally do so too, I mean, there's no pathway to do it, then okay, sure, maybe there are some other laws that people are breaking. I think though, to just draw the conclusion automatically, I think it's a much bigger
stretch. I think it's a much bigger stretch to presume that someone can live in a country 20, 30, 40 years without breaking a law than it is to say that they broke a law.
If that's the kind of a law that they're breaking, and they paid back taxes as part of the DACA law, whatever Dream Act or whatever
So
it is
Paul-
kind of
Paul
law
Manafort,
put in place.
Manafort's in prison for not paying all of his taxes.
Well,
but illegal aliens get a free pass.
Don't get me to defend what happened to Paul Manafort. I'm not going to do that. And no, I'm not saying a free pass.
Let's keep going down the list, though. Let's keep going down the list.
Back taxes.
Every individual, when they turn 18, whether they're a legal U.S. citizen or not, are obligated, if they're a man, they're obligated to sign up for selective service. They're obligated to sign up for the draft. Illegal aliens do not have an exemption. Illegal alien compliance with that law is barely any, right? Right off the bat, you can literally say that almost every male illegal alien who either turned 18 at the time and were in this country, or came into this country before the reporting requirement had ended, has committed a felony by not signing up for selective service.
Well, of course they're not going to sign up for selective services, because then they're immediately.
I thought you just said they're Americans. I thought you just said this was their country.
No. I'm saying that, not saying that they're American citizens.
There's
a difference between
country,
sort of being culturally, having become culturally American, and being.
This is their country. They deserve to be Americans, but they also deserve a pass for not volunteering to fight for the country that they say is already there.
But here's the thing: in terms of your notion of a pass, and I certainly think that it is entirely reasonable to include in any sort of legal status legislation something that accounts for any of those types of violations that you're listing out.
Nancy Pelosi's
I think we
bill,
could do that in that sort of situation.
The bill that Nancy Pelosi is pushing, I believe it's H.R. 6, would allow for someone to get amnesty and a pathway to citizenship as long as they have not committed more than 4 misdemeanor crimes, have not spent time in prison more than 4 collective years. So basically, they can't have gone to prison more than 4 times for any more than 1 year. 4 misdemeanors, 4 prison sentences is now the cap for the Democrats' amnesty bill, the one that Republicans say, oh, needs some work, but we can maybe get on board with this if you change a few things. To say that they're talking about giving amnesty to actual criminals is not a misnomer. It's not hyperbolic. It's not hyperbolic.
No, fair. I see what you're saying. No, I mean, I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying I support Pelosi's legislation.
No, it's
and
fine.
I haven't looked into specific details. I'm speaking more big picture in terms of, I haven't crafted or looked in depth into the specific legislative proposals that have been put forward there. So I'm speaking a bit more into the big picture concepts here that we're talking about. But in terms of the Pelosi's law, or bill, you're raising some tremendous points about why that legislation probably, if you're going to do some sort of a legal status, that's probably not the way to go. Yeah, no,
there was a famous book by Harvey Silverglate called 3 Felonies a Day. And the book basically laid out the argument that the average American unknowingly commits 3 felonies a day without even realizing it. I just think it is fairy tale to think that illegal aliens living in this country for decades would not either commit just as many crimes or more. I think it's
if you're convicted of crime, then that can open another circumstance. But unfortunately, and I know we're about time to wrap up. My car was stolen, as you know, a couple of weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago tonight, my car was stolen, and I have to hop on a call with my insurance because my insurance people have to do a second interview with me, recorded it. It's just a hassle.
Well, that's fine.
Not to get personal, but I got to run.
No, that's fine. Well, any final words about anything that we talked about this episode?
Max McGuire is going to be joining me tomorrow on my show, Jimmy at the Crossroads, of course, in partnership with the Washington Examiner. So you can go on my Facebook page, which I think you guys link to on Facebook, and then also on YouTube, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. So be on about 10:30 Mountain Time, 12:30 Eastern Time. And I'm looking forward to it. I think we'll dive into the Michael Flynn saga a little bit, because what's going on there is just – I'm stunned. I mean, man, the double standards and everything that's going on here, absolutely outrageous.
It really is, yeah. Well, I'm happy to come on tomorrow. And we did include links in the description if you want to check out his show on our YouTube stream as well as our Facebook stream. Links are in the description. Well, that's going to be it for this edition of the Conservative Daily Podcast. Remember that you can download the podcast on the Apple Podcast as well as the Google Play Store, as well as you can find us on the Podbean app as well as conservative-daily.com. Thank you again, Jimmy, for being on the show. My name is Max McGuire. Remember that the fight to take back our country is not over, but the only way we can win is if we all stand and fight together.